Aloha. My name's Chase Livingston, and I'm a law student in my last semester at the William S. Richardson School of Law. It's an honor to be here with you today in this beautiful venue and with such experienced and knowledgeable people such as yourselves. I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing our panelists here. First, we have Rachel James. Rachel is a colleague of mine at the law school. She's an evening part-time student, which means that she works a day job all day and then goes to law school at night. She's a project manager at HCAT, where she manages the program's hydrogen portfolio, coordinates community outreach, and advances their student engagement efforts. In law school, Rachel has served as a fellow of the Energy Justice Program. This work has afforded her the opportunity to engage in community energy planning on the neighbor islands and to present her research at the Hawaii Conservation Conference. Her research is focused on international and national models of community resource management and the application of community-based approaches to the development of renewable energy. After law school, she plans to continue her work in environmental and energy justice. Next, we have Stephen Rimshaw. Stephen relocated to Kauai in 2003. He focuses primarily on clean energy planning, renewable integration, project development, and regulatory policy within his numerous roles for Kauai Island Utility Cooperative and the Maui Electric Company. He was briefly responsible for SunEdison's Hawaii wind and solar fleet before joining Sunrun's public policy team in early 2016. Today, from Stephen's home office on Maui, he currently participates in DER and grid modernization working groups within many regulatory proceedings across 10 states, multiple ISOs, and NERC. Elise Mazie is a program manager for the Distributed Energy Resource Strategy and Policy at the Hawaiian Electric Companies. She managed the successful implementation of the company's most recent DER programs in 2018 and 2019, which earned her a nomination for the Project Management Institute's Project Manager of the Year. She joined the utility in 2017 after working for several years in the photovoltaic construction industry in the Aloha State. Although a native of North Carolina, she's called Hawaii home for the last 10 years, and when not working hard on projects related to DER strategy and policy, she enjoys sailing with her husband and friends. So I'm briefly going to just give you an idea of the way we're going to run our panel today. It might be a little bit different. We're going to start with a broad introduction to DERs, followed by what's called the Pecha Kucha presentation, which I'll explain in a moment. Then we'll get into a discussion, followed by audience questions. Feel free to submit questions using the online question submission system, and we'll get to those at the end. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, because this is such an important topic, I'd like to start with Elise and have each panelist explain what are distributed energy resources and what that means to them. Elise?
Distributed energy resources are most commonly thought of as customer-sited solar. It includes more than that. It's also electric vehicles, other battery systems, demand response, and even energy efficiency. Today I'll be focusing on customer-sited DER that is connected to the distribution power grid.
Awesome. Stephen?
Great. And for me, a DER is really any device capable of responding to power system need in a passive or active nature. This may be to market signals such as time of use, traditional infrastructure deferral, bulk system services for capacity, energy, excess energy, and ancillary services.
Awesome.
I think DER is essentially all of the above. It's a panoply of things, and I think it really, as a framework, presents an opportunity to really look to what individuals, or we can say the market, but really what people need from their energy system. And so lots could fall in the bucket of DER.
Well, as you can see, DERs encompass a pretty vast array of resources and concepts, and it's evolving every day. So in an effort to cover such a large amount of territory here, we're going to use a presentation style called Pecha Kucha. Pechakucha was developed in Japan, and it originally consisted of 20 slides automatically advancing every 20 seconds. We're going to do it a little bit differently here with 30-second automatic advancements. And I know it's a little bit different, but I think you're in for a treat. So we're going to go ahead and let Rachel kick it off, followed by Stephen, then Elise. So take it away, Rachel.
Thanks, Chase. So DER, that feels like the acronym of the hour. And I'd really like to encourage the audience to think a little bit differently about DER and perhaps drift away from the distributed energy resources definition and think about DER as a democratic energy redistribution process. I mentioned democratic because we're here in America, but also because democracies really allow a large participation pool. It allows lots of voices to participate in decision-making processes. I feel many of us are familiar with democracies, likely because you live in a place that is the governmental default. But many of us are also aware of democracies because we hear daily of places that don't have those type of processes, that don't welcome dissenting voices, where people aren't generally given the opportunity to engage in decision-making processes. But here again, in the United States, our default is democracy. And so we have an expectation of engaging not only with our government as individuals, but really we have an expectation of democratic engagement in many of our other processes. So the ways in which we engage with one another, the way we engage with industries, the way we engage really all across the board, we have a default of democracy. And so when I'm talking about democracy, I'm thinking of democracy with four basic key components. The first of which is free and fair elections of leaders and the change of those leaders, as well as active participation of citizens. I'm also speaking of the protection of human rights of all people and the rule of law that is applied equally. So if we think of these four key components in a democracy, what's missing is an overarching concept, which is really the necessity for checks and balances. And so a democracy is effective because it allows that system of checks and balances really empowered by people's vote. And whether we vote through elections, whether we're voting with our dollars, whether we're voting with our voices, or we're voting by the absence of our voice, essentially a democracy is effective because people are able to engage in the process freely and their voices are heard. So I'm sure many of you here have probably sat in on a discussion or heard someone talk about a decision where you felt like if your voice was reflected in that process, the outcome would have been different. We can readily say to one another, if someone had asked me, XYZ could have happened differently. I think that expectation, again, of democratic engagement is our default here. And so by this point, you're probably thinking, I thought I came to an energy conference. Why is she talking so much about politics? I didn't come here to get schooled on democratic processes. True, you are at an energy conference. But because you're at a clean energy conference, really the conversation is broader than just the specifics of the technologies. The conversation around clean energy has to be more broad, and it has to include democratic ideals, because it really is about redistributing energy, and not just energy as far as the technical aspect of energy, but the energy that we put into the building of our systems. So I'm hopeful that our discussion today will turn on the proverbial light bulb, where we can branch a little bit further into thinking about energy planning as an active participation process where stakeholders from various backgrounds are involved, where we can think about energy development that protects human rights, like the access to a clean and healthful environment, and access to clean power, not just as an energy resource, but really to the benefits of clean energy planning. I feel it's essential for us to think this way, not just because we're here in America again, but because this democratic ideal is one that is readily applied to the distribution side of our energy network. If we're thinking about clean energy with this democratic default, I think a quick question that we can ask ourselves is, why aren't we engaging more people in the energy planning process? There are lots of questions, or lots of answers to that question. Energy is complicated. You need technical minds. You have credits that expire readily. Regulatory systems are changing. Yes, all of those things are definitely present. But the fact of the matter is that access to energy, and especially access to clean energy, really is a human right. And as we progress in a world that is increasingly dependent on the access to electricity, we can see increasing disparities between people who have that access and those who don't. And so while it's complicated, I really feel like at its core, energy from a physics perspective is very basic. It's a capacity for doing work. So I have the capacity for doing work. My fellow panelists have the capacity for doing work. Really, everyone in this audience has the capacity for doing work. And so I'm sure you can think of in your communities, your neighbors, collectively, you all have this capacity for doing work. And really what we're talking about is how do we harness that? So if we look to our communities, we look to one another, we start to better understand this capacity for doing work, I think it allows us and really encourages us to think about more closely who we're engaging in the decision-making process. As a project manager at HCAT, I have the privilege of working with the Hawaii Air National Guard. There we're working to develop a renewable energy microgrid, and one of the big takeaways from that process is their mission is not necessarily our mission. So the mission for the Hawaii Air National Guard is twofold. It involves both the state mission, which is essentially to protect Hawaii's people and the land here, and then there's a federal mission. The federal mission is in support of the Air Force. The Air Force's mission is to fly, fight, and win. So if you put Hawaii's Center for Advanced Transportation Technologies, that's the full of HCAT, if you put us with our contractor who's designing the microgrid with the Hawaii Air National Guard, although we're all talking about energy, the conversation looks very different from each of our perspectives. What we learned pretty readily is that we were lacking a common operating language. So while we were all talking about energy, we understood the benefits that renewable energy could provide. We were really having a challenge talking about energy planning and what decisions to make because we didn't have a common operating language. So I was really fortunate to engage in a process called Pathways to an Open Grid, and I was fully burdened with the questions of our engagement with the Hawaii Air National Guard campus. And Pathways to an Open Grid was a process that Kevala, GridWorks, Hawaii Natural Energy Institute, and a number of other stakeholders participated in, which essentially took ideas from a variety of perspectives and used that to develop a tool, a grid assessor tool. And that tool really was able to surface data and analytics in a way that allowed each of the participants to speak about energy development from a common operating language. So Kevala is here today too, so if you have an interest in this process as well as the tool, it's really awesome because it was based here on Oahu, but it's branched now across the state. So if we have this default of democracy, we have this capacity for doing work, we have this desire to harness that capacity, what are we waiting for? I think in many cases what we're waiting for is me, and we're waiting for you. And we're waiting for all the me's and you's that work in our individual industries, that have conversations with people who understand the energy lingo. We're really waiting for us to have that conversation with people who are less familiar, because ultimately, those are the people who are the end users. And those are the people that we need to engage more in the process. When we're having conversations with just one another and we're planning for other people, and we're not really looking at what benefit they could provide to the planning process, I think we're missing a substantial opportunity to plan better. In an age of climate change and increasing resilient requirements, it's necessary to engage the end user, not only because of the benefits that clean energy provides to the environment, but because of the dire need of our energy system to support not only just our way of life, but in an island place, really, it supports all that we do. I know this could probably sound a little uncomfortable. It's often much easier to have conversations with people who readily understand us. It's often challenging to have a conversation with someone who may not necessarily understand the restrictions that you have, or the requirements that you're held to, or the responsibilities that your organization shoulders. That's totally understandable. But I think we have to really embrace that uncertainty and engage more people in understanding how we can equitably distribute energy. Again, using that framework of the democratic energy redistribution. So that redistribution happens when we ask more people, when we follow models like Hawaii Energy, who reaches deeply into communities to understand how to make energy efficiency and renewable energy benefits more accessible to individuals. Hawaii Energy has spent a good amount of time focusing on how to be less hard to reach, and so making sure that access to clean energy technologies is available to more people. I think we could do well collectively to follow that model more closely. And so as I have this conversation, I feel like this is really not anything new. It's something that I think is reflected in many of the conversations this morning. It's something that's certainly reflected in the recent RFP, where the Hawaiian electric companies made a requirement for community outreach. And that has not been done before in the regulatory process. While that was a utility scale requirement, I think we could learn a lot from that in understanding how to engage communities on the behind the meter side. Lastly, I'd just like to say that as we think about the things that we've accomplished thus far, and we understand how DERs could be reframed as democratic energy redistribution systems, I'd really encourage us to look back and ask why on some of the things that we've done in the past, but to really focus on looking forward and asking why not. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, next we're going to hear from Stephen. And go.
Well, thankfully, Ed had a very nice keynote this morning, and you heard quite a bit about Sunrun, so I apologize for this slow introduction in the next slide. The next slide was in Ed's presentation as well, even though we are a company of 4,000 employees in 22 plus states. The slide had a typo on it. It was from an ITER working group presentation in California about 3 weeks ago, and bullet number 3 says we've deployed over 1.3 megawatts of residential storage. That is a wrong statistic. It was noted yesterday, and it's 1.5 gigawatt hours. So massive scale difference. I'm not sure if anyone noticed that and questioned why that low value was there, but I think what's important, you know, we talked about Sunrun. I love 2.3 minutes a day a solar system goes in. So as you start looking at Hawaii and, you know, the needs of the system, in the 2013 Reliability Standards Working Group, it called for coordinated interconnection, NT&D access planning, but it's really absent in past iterations of the Power Supply Improvement Plan, as well as today's current IGP process that we should hear more about. HECO has been working for years to develop DR programs with success now for the bulk system, so virtual power plants are about here, but there's no coordinated planning across power system domains, which we need for Hawaii stakeholders to maximize value. We heard a little bit about stakeholder engagement in the IGP process. You know, thankfully, we had a recent PUC order that opened up the engagement process because, you know, from my perspective as someone that advocates in working groups across the country, you know, I have very limited ability to participate in the current IGP process as it stands. So I'm grateful that we should be getting some greater opportunity to participate there. I think it's good to look at history and where we are today. In 2010, there was actually a brief memorandum. We could not have any more solar on the islands of Maui and the island of Hawaii. At that point, it was 6% in relationship to peak, which has grown to over 54% in relationship to peak today. So dramatic changes have occurred of what seemed impossible at that time. And a lot of that has to do with political pressure of what Hawaiian Electric did, which was really progressive and moving ahead of the regulatory process. You know, on the far right here, we had, you know, back in 2010 when the moratorium was discussed, you know, 10% of feeder system peak was the criteria, and then by 2015, it was moving to 250% of daytime minimum load for excess generation capacity, but there was also concerns about NEM and trying to close NEM at that time, so it was kind of used as an ultimatum to go to the next step. You know, here, load loss from distribution planning is really important. You know, we need to worry about the load shapes of these distribution circuits so customers can easily interconnect. We don't pay for wire infrastructure or non-wire infrastructure that's not needed. As you see on this graphic here from October, the whole red area represents a 25% load loss from energy efficiency to whatever means, and HECO is out of compliance with their tariff, which is really challenging. So to understand the demand side resources, how they may align with the needs of the power system, this recent Vox article looked into research from some prior IEEE authors, Martini and Taft. You know, their research concluded that, you know, they're worried that it will ultimately increase the cost and complexity of this maximum or minimum DSO or planning, which is it's really an extension of today and what's happening in California. So you look at the graphic on the left and right. The left is a reasonable load shape we're used to seeing, increasing in the day, peaking in the evening. Now you have market integration from a battery storage system on the far right, which dramatically changes the planning profile and the ability for future customers to interconnect. So this feeder is providing a bulk system service, but what is the long-range planning impact, and where will it be 30 years from now and before then on how to interconnect these customers? So another model is really this maximum DSO model. It's based on consumer-centric bottom-up planning instead of top-down planning as we saw in the minimum DSO model. Here, the DSO balances supply and demand to the extent possible with local DERs, coordinates those assets, and optimizes them. So here is an example of what it's doing, where our power system is aggregated for DERs, and some of the load shift working group products that I'll discuss working later, discuss challenge of this problem. Feature DER operational profiles, enabling non-wire alternative capacity and capacity services in multiple planning domains is absolutely needed, so we can save money and lower the cost of energy in 2045. And just stepping back to this, I want a distribution system load profile that looks reasonable, that allows any customer to interconnect, that we don't have power quality issues in the middle of the day and cannot interconnect customers. If we're aggregating DERs for the system level, again, what's going to happen to these customers on the circuit? It is definitely providing a system need that's needed, but could that be better coordinated and optimized for planning efforts across the island? So in California, there was a long engagement process in the load shift working group. Definitely opportunities for load shift in California, in Hawaii here, but it's a very open process. 63 agencies, and at the same time, there was the CAISO, PDR, LSR working groups going on. So how do you integrate a load shift model into the CAISO markets, but at the same time, what are the right participation models to be enabling load shift services from multiple parties? So within that working group process, there was 6 products developed. They were, you can look across the spectrum here from, market integration perspective. Are they market informed? Are they integrated with the CAISO? Or is there a broad spectrum? Where are they located? Is there clarity of, are they on a circuit? Is this a region of California? Or what sort of granular data can you provide? So 2 of the load shift working group products I'm going to talk about really aim to create this super DSO, and building upon what the maximum DSO is. I think the super DSO is really addressing this planning challenge we have all across the U.S. where customers go through the interconnection process and planning stops, and then through long-range planning efforts, there may be a substation or other issue identified, and then there may or may not be a solution identified as an all-wire alternative or other means. But we need to be planning for the integration of renewable energy and ensuring our customers can easily interconnect. And this next market model goes a step further of how do we further maximize that distribution system operator and really empower them and integrate them within the markets. The first product I didn't talk too much about due to this time constraints was the permanent load shift product. This product is not a permanent load shift, but the customer is agreeing to being dispatched within multiple time domains of excess energy and system peaking is to provide operational flexibility at the distribution system level, which can also be a mismatch from the bulk system, so ensure power quality is addressed. And how do you bring this all together? So in the ITER proceedings in California, we're talking about distribution deferral through tariff mechanisms as well as solicitations, but what we proposed a couple of weeks ago was really this grid needs platform where anyone can bring their own device. They're telling the utility, I have a smart device that can be communicated and dispatched through a service aggregator to provide distribution capacity, infrastructure deferral, clean peaking capacity, and excess energy capacity. So once a need's identified, there's a cost-effective solution in the field and an option for the utility to call on it and begin immediate dispatch. And just looking around the country at Hawaii Energy and energy storage, Massachusetts was the first state to incorporate energy efficiency into their mandates for energy storage. You know, Hawaii Energy is working on, you know, their next phase. How do they move into grid services? You know, there's massive amounts of opportunities. How do we bring the locational value to integrate DERs to get to the customer? Hawaii Energy, in partnership with Hawaii Electric, through programmatic design, solicitations, tariff, let's get it done, let's innovate now, and ensure we're planning for 2045, where every customer is going to want a DER and can still easily interconnect and lower costs, sure.
Whew, thank you. All right. Last but certainly not least, Elise.
I serve Hawaiian Electric's ratepayers as the program manager of Distributed Energy Resources Strategy and Policy. I joined the Hawaiian Electric companies just a year and a half ago after spending most of my career in Hawaii's photovoltaic industry. In my time with the companies, I operationalized the new DER programs, Customer Grid Supply Plus, Smart Export, and Net Energy Metering Plus. Imagine a hero from history or film. Picture a pivotal piece of their story. Your hero is likely confronting external challenges that seem insurmountable while wrestling with their own internal imperfections. I believe Hawaiian Electric is a hero in the narrative of our energy transition. We're confronting challenges that can seem insurmountable while wrestling our own internal imperfections, but we are striving to be innovative leaders in the energy transition of our industry. Our customers are active participants in the process of change in a huge way through distributed energy resources. Hawaii is leading the nation. On my home island of Oahu, 1 in 3 single-family homes has solar. Across the islands, that's 18% of our residential customer base. Next in line is Connecticut at roughly 6%, and California at roughly the same. The Hawaiian Electric companies are committed to a 100% renewable future for Hawaii by 2045 and are on track to hit the goals set by state initiative. Our next renewable portfolio standard milestone is 30% in 2020. At the end of 2018, we're at 27%. The following milestone of 40% comes in 2030. We could launch past our next goal years ahead of schedule with the renewable dispatchable generation power purchase agreements that were filed with the Commission just last week. There are 7 of those, and they have the lowest pricing we've seen in the state to date. We added nearly 4,000 PV systems last year, bringing the total to roughly 77,000 across our territories, with 1,000 more approved for installation. As we push toward our 2045 goal, we are planning for 50% of our energy needs to be provided for by customer-sited resources. Customer resources are an important part of our strategy to 100%, but only if it's done in alignment and coordination with the rest of the grid. If not, then it can actually be detrimental to our state's path to 100%. Visibility and dispatchability improves alignment and coordination, and the Public Utilities Commission acknowledged this with the latest 3 programs. All 3 have systems that make the production visible, and the only program designed to export midday can be dispatched or managed in an extreme grid event. We stood up a DER management system this year that'll enable those capabilities. The combined capacity of PV, distributed PV on Oahu, is 2.5 times the size of the largest traditional generator. To describe this in metaphor, without visibility, we're asking system operations to drive blindfolded. Without dispatchability, our driver has no means to manage the brakes or accelerator. With these tools, operators can manage balancing because supply must always match demand. Customers can interconnect photovoltaics via any of our 8 customer renewable programs. Net energy metering was closed by PUC order in 2015 to new applicants, that is. Customer grid supply has the most lucrative export compensation currently available. Customer self-supply systems typically include batteries and are not configured to export. Standard interconnection agreements provide an option to connect large systems, typically over 100 kilowatts. The next generation of programs are more sophisticated. Customer Grid Supply Plus is that first program with the visibility and dispatchability our driver systems operations needs. And Smart Export is the first program here with time variable compensation, which incentivizes export during peak demand. Net Energy Metering Plus allows existing NEM customers to add non-export capacity to their systems. And community-based renewable energy will allow access to renewable energy to anyone, especially renters or folks in apartments. We have a lot of programs open. Several have no caps, and with a few exceptions, there is a lot of room available. This year, we're taking action to market these programs to our customers. And we are looking forward to a simpler universe of programs, as mentioned in the prior panel. There are a number of ways to increase interconnections. Timely charging of electric vehicles is one of those. Demand response is another. As I mentioned, we stood up our DERMS, DER management system, earlier this year. Electric buses are another means. Our e-bus tariff was approved last week, which incentivizes midday and overnight charging. Non-wires alternatives, traditional wires upgrades, and there are many other means, all of which are being planned for or actively implemented. The interconnection experience plays an important role for customers, and we have come a long way. We now have a browser-based application that walks you through the process and shows your application's status along the way. This system automates the initial technical review on Oahu, and further automation is anticipated for Maui Electric, Hawaii Electric Light, and for further steps in the process. So thankfully, we have moved past a lot of the limitations, technical limitations that previously created queues. The future of solar is grid-tied and contributes as a grid resource. This is another means to create the coordination and alignment that I mentioned before. We aim to increase connectivity and accessibility by overcoming technical limitations and expanding the options to provide energy and grid services. And grid services will enable future customer income streams, likely through aggregators. The future of DER is unknown, but we are watching it closely. We're looking at ways to build this market to ensure that it's sustainable into 2045. Imagine a future where all customers that want DER are DER customers. We have more efficient panels, smarter inverters, affordable and reliable battery systems, and 50% of our energy mix comes from customer-sited resources. So if you take anything away from my talk, know DER is essential to Hawaiian Electric, and we need the photovoltaic industry to grow. In most situations, we interconnect photovoltaics quickly, and we are constantly improving. We are planning for a future where all customers are DER customers, and to us, the true measure of success is the energy future we leave for generations to come.
All right, thank you. As you can see, the Petra Kucha style of presentation can be quite challenging, but it really manages to pack in a lot of information. So really appreciate our panelists bearing with me in this different style. Before we dive into the discussion here, I want to just give our panelists a quick opportunity to respond to anything that came up during those presentations. This will be a brief response, and we'll go ahead and start with Stephen.
Sure. I don't think I have too much of a response. I mean, definitely Hawaiian Electric's been in a hard planning challenge for a number of years. You know, when Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative was going on, you know, no one anticipated this growth, the economic realities that we have today. And, you know, how do you plan for that? You know, back on Kauai, when I was doing system planning there, the level of DERs was very small, and planning was a lot easier. And now that you have to plan for DERs that has broad cost impacts that need to be accounted for, and that from the distribution system up through the bulk system, how do we coordinate these assets? And I think Hawaiian Electric's going to get there, and it's through the stakeholder process that we hopefully will. But my concern is that with this current IGB process is where there's other regions, probably California, that are going to be looking at different ways of managing and coordinating these assets, as well as New York. There's a new working group just started up kind of looking at this Dso model and what's appropriate there. So I guess my concern is if it's 5 years out and we haven't done a lot of focus in this cycle of the IGP of how to embrace the customer, how to ensure these load shapes do not cause investments that are not needed, and how do we provide non-wire alternatives to address those load shapes and entice more customers to participate. I just worry about continuous delays, because we've had a lot of delays and some good recent successes on the utility scale, but how do we innovate quicker and move quicker? Thank you.
That's always a very difficult challenge, especially in the context that we are currently in with the climate crisis. Rachel, anything you'd like to add? No? Elise?
Rachel, you mentioned to the group here that DER should be free and fair, and I want to second that statement. I think it's very important that DER is fair to all customers, and we are all familiar with the subsidy that happened with our earliest DER program, and we need to ensure that we're not putting this energy transition on the backs of those who couldn't afford to install solar. You also mentioned that the access to clean energy is a human right, and I think that's very important as well. We need to do the right thing, especially for the island nations around us that are at an even lower elevation and are not creating the greenhouse gases that we are creating. So thank you for that point as well. I wanted to mention to you, Stephen, that I think part of what you're describing is here today. Hawaiian Electric's system is driven by bottom-up customer decision-making in a huge way when they choose to install photovoltaics. And also we have distribution system operation. Our Hawaiian Electric systems operators manage the transmission and distribution system. And that integration makes sense for a relatively small utility and landscape like ours. Integration leads to efficiency and hopefully leads to lower costs for our ratepayers. That's all for now, thanks.
Any follow-up on that, or should we get into some questions? All right. So one thing that really came through for me in all of these presentations is that DERs are going to be an ever-growing aspect of our energy landscape. And as they become increasingly ubiquitous, the benefits that they can provide are compounded when they're managed together or aggregated. So my question is, what does aggregation look like in Hawaii now, and how should or could it look in the future? And whoever wants to start can go ahead.
Sure. Aggregation is a real thing in Hawaii. We have our first contract signed for demand response aggregation. We have another in the works and another in the works specifically for distributed PV aggregation. We are developing RFPs to seek out further providers, and generally what we've seen so far, most are storage-based, so focusing on regulating reserves.
Sure. I would say aggregation maybe started a little earlier as we were transitioning away from NEM in Hawaii with the self-supply tariff, because that was the first opportunity that there's now a different load shape that the utility can plan for, and you have an aggregated resource on service nodes, the utility knows where that is, and on a system-wide basis operating in a manner. So, that aggregation has started and it's moving out there. So there's definitely more opportunities for passive aggregation, like the ISO New England forward capacity market that was discussed earlier. That's, those can be scheduled response times based on the needs of the system, or they can also be active dispatches, such as, CAISO and other markets. So there's a lot of ways of using aggregations, and passive and active is a great opportunity. Thank you.
I, as a non-technical participant in this conversation, would really love to see aggregation really focus on how communities are developing. If we look at Hawaii's community energy plans, we can see areas where we have expected development. And I'd love to see aggregation really address how we can plan for resources like communities that maybe have shared ride systems. And if those shared rides are all electric vehicles, and if that electric vehicle system is powered by a utility connected or some clean energy system that allows really the aggregation of that community resource to be part of the development process. So I think a lot of the aggregation that is taking place is really reliant on specific technologies and aggregating those technologies. And I'd really love to see the future of aggregation reach more deeply into seeing what assets are in communities, what assets are in locales, or to look more deeply at that locational net benefit analysis to see how we can better aggregate.
So just to follow up a little bit on that, I've recently come across some interesting ideas about how the utility can really facilitate a system where these aggregated DERs begin to blur the line between a centralized, or sometimes referred to a utility scale, resource and these distributed energy resources. So is that possible? And if so, how can we support the utility in reaching that goal?
I'm drawing a blank on what I was going to initially kick off the question.
Sure,
about.
I can ask it again just to refresh. So DERs, as they are aggregated, can begin to blur the line between the traditional notion of a centralized power plant and what's sometimes referred to as a virtual power plant. So is that possible? And if so, how can we facilitate that option?
Great. So thank you for repeating yourself. I think it's certainly possible. I think you need to look at the participation models and how you're addressing this issue. Are these 24/7 services? Are these, capacity services within different time domains that can be met from a mix of resources? You look at, in California, the non-wire alternative, solutions they're looking at, and like in New York is a better example, where just a massive mix of resources to meet that broad need, and it's really going to take that broad mix to really make it work.
I agree that it's definitely possible to blur the lines. The resources, however, it will probably be battery backed, but even if they're firm in that manner, they're still finite. So yes, the line can be blurred, but they'll never really be able to take the place of the traditional resources. Also, I think we can support the utility in making that happen more so by having more flexible resources available. The real key to opening up more photovoltaics is to have other resources that can ramp up and down quickly to support the photovoltaics when a passing cloud happens or worse.
So since I work in hydrogen, this question just brings to mind really using hydrogen as a resource. And in terms of how do we, like if the lines blur, I think the lines can't blur when we think about really capturing unused energy. And so to the extent that you can plan for hydrogen generation through electrolysis, if you have a large load that you can place on the system when you need a large load and you can plan for that, that seems like something that you could, in theory, do at utility scale and essentially blur that line. And how we help the utility to think about things like that is really to share the information that we're learning as we're doing projects. For me, with the Air Force Research Laboratory, but entities like Hawaii Natural Energy Institute, Anji has deep background in hydrogen in many of their other locations across the U.S. and around the globe. So I think there's a wealth of information. There's a lot of projects that are happening around the globe at utility scale that are utilizing hydrogen because they're planning for that hydrogen application in their vehicle transportation systems as for stationary fuel cells. So again, I think if we look not just at where we're sending power, but really what we need to use power for, we can better understand, and if those lines blur, if it's best to blur them, then we can blur it then.
Fantastic, and I think that's actually a great segue into a question from the audience here. So the question is, how do you think the load growth from the expected adoption of EVs will impact the DER discussion?
It's largely dependent on how well the job is done putting out a charger network for them. If we have load growth from electric vehicles that is charging while we're at our workplaces during midday when solar production is so very high, it will increase our DER integration.
Yeah, there was a recent study out in the last week or so of trillions of dollars that needed to be spent for electrification infrastructure. And that probably wasn't even the full spectrum of what's really needed in reality. There's definitely a big push towards electrification of hot water for grid services as well as vehicles. I think when I talked briefly about the grid service platform we proposed in California, and one of those tariffs is around clean peaking capacity. So how can the utility, if they have a local need that EV charging is building up and there's no other means of controlling and you have a power quality issue, let's not go and upgrade the wire. Let's activate these DERs in these locations and allow them to be paid a capacity service for that deferral benefit where the utility shares, the ratepayers benefit, and everyone wins, and we're creating the clean economy we're trying to achieve.
I think if we're only thinking of electric vehicles as plug-in electric vehicles, then yes, the load discussion can follow very much what Elise and Stephen shared. But if we broaden the aperture and really consider electric vehicles as fuel cell electric vehicles, and we start to understand how we can augment our plug-in electric vehicle infrastructure with our fuel cell electric vehicle infrastructure, I think we can manage that load shape, and if it needs to be large, let it be large. But if it can be compensated by, again, adding large loads to be able to absorb power to make hydrogen so that you can power long-range buses to get over places that are hilly or to go from Honolulu to Waianae. Sorry, I'm not super familiar with Maui places, so I can't give locational reference points here. But yeah, I think if we're only looking at the small piece of electric vehicle load as plug-in EVs, we're missing a large opportunity to plan better.
Great answers. And so I have another question here. So let me display. Elise claimed a cross-subsidy as a result of net energy metering. Has HECO done a cost-benefit analysis to support that claim? I guess this is a question for you, Elise.
And I'm sorry to say, with my short duration of time at Hawaiian Electric, I don't have the exact answer to that question, but I'm sure there are people in the room that do. We're monitoring our costs of service, and we try to have a great understanding of what it costs to provide our services to our ratepayers, and we want to make sure that it's fair to all. So whomever has asked that question, if you could please find me afterward, we'll be sure to find you the answer.
Great, thank you.
So I don't know of any formal studies that have been done, but I think that's an area where Hawaii maybe hasn't. There's been a lot of studies, and I'm not for value of solar studies, but Maryland, I think, did a good job recently on looking at the broader economical value that the solar workforce can bring, as well as the other clean energy benefits that are provided. So I think we need to look at the whole spectrum of what it does to our economy, but also not just look at solar. We're not just talking about passive solar in Hawaii anymore. We're talking about something much more advanced than that.
Anything to add, Rachel, or move on?
You can move on, thanks.
I should also say that we have a cost of service study that's in the works for DER specifically. So even if we don't have the best answer for you today, it will come soon.
Well, either way, it's an important consideration. So thank you for that question. And thank you for the insightful answer. So one of the foundational concepts of the regulatory compact is the guarantee of universal service. Should our future energy system have a similar guarantee of universal access to participate in DERs and the benefits of a two-way energy system? And how might we accomplish this? I can repeat it.
And for me, it's getting back to the bottom-up planning that we talked about. Again, your questions are long, and I don't remember all the,
I can
the
repeat.
details.
Sorry, I'm in law school. It's what we're trained for. One of the foundational concepts of the regulatory compact is the guarantee of universal service. Should our future energy system have a similar guarantee of universal access to participate in DERs and the benefits of a two-way energy system?
Yeah, I mean, I think the alternative is incredibly more cost-effective and detrimental to the people of Hawaii, because as rates get more expensive, you know, if we aren't leveraging these resources to maximize the most value possible, you know, the costs are going to increase, driving further need to adopt DERs, which may not be aligned with the grid due to, you know, hosting capacity expansion issues. So to make it work, it's got to be an integral part of the long-term planning. How are all these DERs going to align with the most value of the grid? And then the problem solves itself. If you're, you know, planning for the bulk system and not focusing on assuming, you know, how do we expand the hosting capacity of the system to not upgrade this infrastructure, I think you're in a much harder planning spot if you don't, you know, focus from the bottom to address this challenge.
So we're definitely planning for a two-way DER system, and we want to make sure that all customers that want DER are DER customers. And part of how we're making sure we do that is through our grid modernization. Our grid modernization plan is approved, and we got approval of our phase 1 implementation plan just yesterday. So we're taking steps to actively make sure the grid is ready for a two-way flow of energy. We also just need to make sure that we do things that I won't necessarily reiterate from my talk, just to make sure that there are other systems in place like demand response, timely charging of electric vehicles, to make sure that supply can always match demand, because that's the most critical piece of the puzzle for system operators. Supply must always match demand.
It's funny that Stephen mentioned your questions being long. I was like, I'm so used to that length of question that, but that's the law school fun. I think yes was my first answer to your question. Is like, yes, that's what should happen. But if we're talking about systems that need to serve a purpose, and we're not talking about the people that they serve, especially when we live in an island state and when land access is limited and when sea levels are rising and when we need to plan for resilience in addition to just being able to access basic energy, I think we do ourselves a disservice. So yes, I believe there's certainly, we need to pinpoint the technical expertise and we need to understand that conversation. But I think if we have that conversation in absence of having a conversation about how to build a system that allows people to harden in place, especially as we move toward more and more things being reliant on the access to power. I mean, my daughter goes to school and she doesn't really have school books. Like most of her educational opportunities are available through like a Google Classroom. I have to learn all these things, but I'm like, I can't just pick up a book and read something. Like I gotta pick a computer and the computer needs power. And like, so if the way we live is increasingly reliant on the access to energy, like we have to have a discussion about how our system serves the people.
Thank you. And so on that point, another audience question here. Distributed energy resources depend on distributed insight. What more can Hawaii do to distribute insight in order to realize its goals?
You can distribute insight by distributing information. And so, I mean, this is a wonderful venue. This is an awesome conference. But I think the people in this room are probably already familiar with much of the things that we're discussing. And the people who really need this information are likely not in the room. And so we can start by distributing the information is my short answer.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, building off the CPUC and HPUC memorandum, I mean, how do we share best practices. I mean, HECO and the distributions level far exceeds any other utility across the country. They don't believe what's happening here, right? It like doesn't exist to East Coast utilities. There's no way they're integrating at this level. There's no way they're not upgrading service conductors. So how do we, there's an opportunity to educate and be a leader in that way of what we've done here. But then on the other level, there's other progress going on of how these markets should be created, how we defer capacity, and so how do we share and learn? And it sure would be nice if a lot more of the utilities could be more like Hawaiian Electric on the distribution level, and innovate low cost and learn and not be scared, because that's really what's changed. And it's really sad to just all the upgrades happening everywhere, circuits being closed around the country, and why? No real good reason other than being overly conservative in most cases.
I think we saw an example today with our two PUCs coming together with a memorandum of understanding regarding sharing resources. So thank you to our commissioners for taking those steps.
So I've got another audience question here, and we're just about out of time. But this might go a little bit to what you were talking about, Stephen. What are some of the main barriers to the effective implementation of energy technologies that will benefit all people here in Hawaii?
And for me, it's part of the planning charter and what we do as a utility and regulators. Cost causation is not a customer wanting to install a self-consumption battery and then need to go through months of delays, upgrade costs, and broader challenges. How do we simplify and make a system that really works for everyone?
We tend to integrate battery systems at a customer level very quickly. We have a few large systems, more than a few large systems in our standard interconnection agreement programs that are undergoing large interconnection requirement studies, but by and large, we don't have those going on right now. So we are integrating battery systems quickly and within tariff timelines, and we have our own internal timelines that are much shorter than those tariff timelines, and we are holding to those.
So, we talked about smart export tariffs. How about a smart import tariff to avoid curtailment and to really use those distributed storage assets? Has that been considered?
So that was part of the load shift working group that I talked about in California. There's, PDR LSR will start later this fall, where negative market pricing, you can respond, buy power from the grid, stop injections from the grid, throw that energy in a battery, and be compensated for that service. We just don't have that service today here.
So are you aware of any movement towards something like that?
Not with the way that was phrased. However, there is definitely a focus on time of use rates and how those might help customers be able to shape their behavior to the costs that it takes to supply the needs for their behaviors. So I think time of use rates may be an example of a smart import tariff, if you will.
Yeah, but I definitely agree, but I think you need to layer on it. I mean, if you look at some of what Southern California is proposing in a tariff, they're locational time of use plus additional dispatch rights and performance compensation. So there's a lot of ways of looking at this to address these specific needs, and it needs to layer on top of each other, because time of use will get us a long way, but we need to. Time of use isn't going to incentivize, the demand response dispatch of these resources, and we should be getting the additional incremental capacity that's available if there's a greater priority need for the system than a customer self-consuming energy.
So we're just about out of time here, so I wanted to take this opportunity to thank our panelists again, Rachel James, Stephen Rimshaw, and Elise Mazie. How about another round of applause for our panelists here?
And on a last note, I just wanted to follow up on what Mayor Victorino was talking about regarding the importance of involving the youth, the students of our state, and in this process, in these conversations, in order to distribute the knowledge more broadly. And on that note, tomorrow there will be high school students here from throughout the islands who have been generously granted admission to the conference. So if you see those students around, take a moment to speak with them and share some of your expertise with them, because they really are going to be necessary for this transition. So thank you very much.